The air in the west wing crypt of St. Jude's Cemetery was a thick, viscous medium, perpetually saturated with the scent of pulverized limestone, ancient earth, and the mildew that flourished in the absence of sunlight. 11-year-old Elian lay curled on a slab of broken marble, placed precariously between two elaborate but anonymous mausoleums. He was not sleeping. He was merely existing in a state of diminished awareness, fighting the deep, insistent cold that had become the defining characteristic of his life. The rain outside was not a gentle, rhythmic patter. It was a torrential, insistent drumming against the high, vaulted ceiling and the narrow, barred vents that offered the crypt its only grudging connection to the living world. Each cascade sounded like 1,000 tiny hammers relentlessly striking metal, amplifying the pervasive sense of solitude and enclosure. The moisture found its way through hairline cracks in the masonry, carving dark, serpentine paths down the stone walls. It collected on the floor in shallow, spreading puddles that reflected the faint, oily glimmer of the moonless night filtering from above, providing the only illumination beyond the absolute blackness that settled whenever the light faltered. Elian's thin woolen blanket, scavenged weeks ago from a dumpster behind the city laundry, was hopelessly damp. It offered little insulation, serving only to trap the cold against his skin. His teeth worried at his lower lip, a nervous habit that did little to distract from the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He focused entirely on the small, almost negligible warmth generated by pressing his knees tightly against his chest, willing his body to condense its fragile heat. His environment was not just cold, it was oppressive. The crypt was a silent city of the dead, full of high, cold shelves stacked with heavy stone sarcophagi. Elian knew every creaking sound, every shift in the air pressure, every subtle difference in the echoing acoustics of the cavernous space. Survival demanded that he catalogue these details: the rattling of a loose drain pipe near the south wall, the occasional scuttling sound of the large field mice that shared his domain, the steady, rhythmic drip-drip-drip of condensation falling from the highest point of the archway onto the damp granite floor 20 feet below. Tonight, the persistent drumming of the rain intensified the isolation. It blurred the distinction between the inside and the outside, making the crypt feel like the bottom of an ocean, pressed by the heavy weight of the world above. Elian could taste the metallic tang of the damp air, rich with the history of burial and mineral absorption. He shifted slightly, moving his shoulder away from the unforgiving coolness of the marble slab. As he did, his elbow brushed against a rectangular shape positioned against the back wall, slightly recessed into the shadow. This object was familiar. It was part of his routine perimeter check. It was a small, ornate wooden box, about the size of a child's toy chest, which had always rested next to a high, dust-choked stone shelf bearing the name Peregrine. This box was unlike the heavy, solemn stone memorials. It was made of dark, heavily lacquered oak, bound with iron straps that had long since surrendered to rust and corrosion. Elian had previously dismissed it as a minor relic, perhaps a container for funerary offerings long plundered, or maybe just a storage box left by cemetery workers decades ago. It had no inscription, no date, just the elaborate, almost vulgar curling of its corroded iron bands. But tonight, the cold had sharpened his senses to an almost painful degree of awareness. His elbow hadn't simply nudged the wood. He felt a faint, unexpected vibration, a slight give in the material where the iron strap met the wood at the corner closest to the floor. It was a deviation from the predictable rigidity of the crypt. He slowly uncurled himself, the movement agonizingly deliberate to avoid disturbing the mice or making any sound that might carry into the wider, echoing silence of the main hall. The joints in his knees protested with dull, grinding aches that he had learned to ignore. He reached out a hesitant, numb finger, tracing the line of the rusted strap. The rain was still a deafening roar above, a natural sound curtain, but the thought of discovery, of something new in this utterly static environment, created a sudden, intense pulse of adrenaline that briefly countered the cold. He pressed his thumb against the corner where he had felt the movement. The wood, which he had always assumed was a solid structural piece, yielded under pressure. It didn't crack or splinter. It moved smoothly, silently, inward. A small, involuntary gasp escaped him, instantly swallowed by the drumming rain. Elian withdrew his hand as if he had touched a burning ember. Fear, sharp and immediate, laced through him. He was deeply aware that anything hidden in this place, especially something that moved or had a secret compartment, was inherently dangerous. The dead kept their secrets, and the few living people who occasionally trespassed here, grave robbers or vagrants, were often more dangerous than the emptiness itself. He waited, holding his breath, listening not for external sounds, but for the cessation of the cold dread in his own chest. Minutes stretched into an eternity, defined by the slow, painful beat of his own heart. The pervasive smell of wet stone remained dominant. But now, mixed faintly on the air, was the subtle, dry aroma of old, undisturbed timber and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible mustiness, like ancient paper or forgotten cloth. Driven by an urgent, overwhelming curiosity that overshadowed his fear of the unknown, Elian leaned closer. He used the very tip of his index finger to tentatively explore the gap. The movement he had detected was not structural damage, but a deliberate cut in the oak, a seam expertly hidden by the overlapping layer of the iron binding. The box was a shell, a facade. He needed light. His inventory was sparse. In the inner pocket of his jacket, wrapped tightly in a fragment of waxed butcher paper to protect it from the damp, was his most prized possession. A single, short candle stub, barely an inch long, and a box of half-used, damp matches. These were reserved only for absolute necessities, checking for food, avoiding major pitfalls, or perhaps for moments like this. With trembling fingers, he retrieved the items. The sound of the match striking the abrasive strip was a sharp, grating noise in the profound silence of the crypt's interior spaces. It sparked, caught, flickered violently, and then settled into a weak, yellow flame. The light was immediate and startling, pushing back the oppressive shadows that had dominated his world. He cupped his hands around the tiny, precious flame, shielding it from the slightest draught, and held it low, illuminating the base of the wooden object. In the candlelight, the deception was painfully obvious. The object was indeed the size of a small chest, resting on the floor against the wall. But the iron bands were not purely decorative. They were functional, holding together a casing that was distinct from the main structure. The wood was deeply stained, appearing solid, but the light revealed the perfect, nearly invisible line of a rectangular panel running along the bottom 3/4 of the box. The panel was slightly recessed, flush with the floor, giving the illusion that the whole piece was one massive, immutable block of oak. He carefully set the candle down on the marble slab, propping it against a loose chunk of concrete so the flame aimed toward the hidden object. The intensity of the light seemed to make the surrounding shadows thicker, more menacing, but he ignored them, focusing solely on the object before him. He searched his immediate vicinity, desperately needing a tool. The only implement he owned was a rusty spoon, useful for eating, but useless for leverage. His eyes scanned the damp earth floor surrounding the marble slab. A few feet away, partially buried in the perpetually shifting silt that washed in from the vents, he spotted something dark and linear. It was a shard of iron, perhaps a broken section of a handrail or an extremely thick nail. It was covered in a crust of heavy, flaking rust, cold and rough to the touch. This, he recognized, might serve as a crude pry bar. He grasped the iron shard, its cold mass heavy and reassuring in his small hand. He returned to the mock coffin. The pressure point he had found earlier was exactly where the bottom panel met the fixed upper shell. He inserted the thin, pointed end of the iron shard into the minute gap. It was tight, requiring significant force, and his hands, already weakened by chronic malnutrition, shook with the effort. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the cold, damp air. This was the moment of commitment. If he made a loud noise, or if the panel resisted and snapped, he risked drawing attention, not just from the cemetery watchmen, who rarely ventured into the deep recesses of the West Wing, but from the unseen threats that always seemed to hover just outside the candlelight's radius. He pressed the tool inward, not attempting to pry yet, but merely to seat the tip securely. The metal scraped against wood with a thin, whining sound, a noise that felt monstrously loud in the enclosed space. Then he applied a small, increasing pressure, using the floor as his fulcrum. Creak. The sound was not violent. It was the soft, protesting groan of aged wood separating from its long-held bond. A rush of dry, stale air puffed out of the opening, carrying the distinct musky odor of undisturbed antiquity. Elian paused again, listening. The rain hammered on, indifferent to his small act of transgression. Nothing stirred in the black depths of the crypt. The mice remained silent. He continued, applying steady, slow force. The panel began to yield, swinging outward on a series of hidden hinges that moved with surprising, oiled grace despite the object's age. The iron binding, he now realized, was purely aesthetic, intended to make the object look like a sealed, immovable antique chest. As the panel swung fully open, it did not reveal a hollow space, nor did it reveal bones or dirt. It revealed another box, nested perfectly inside the first. This inner container was not wood or stone. It was a sturdy, heavily riveted box of dull, tarnished brass, polished smooth by time or handling, and secured with a substantial lock that looked far too modern for the rest of the setting. The lock, however, was clearly sprung. The heavy brass shackle hung loosely from the hasp, having been violently, or perhaps delicately, defeated at some point in the past. A wave of profound disappointment washed over Elian, cold as the marble beneath him. It had been found, accessed, and looted already. He had risked the little safety he possessed for an empty container. He felt a sharp sting of tears welling behind his eyes, a reaction not just to the failure, but to the exhausting weight of constant, false hope. He reached out, his fingers tracing the cool, heavy surface of the brass. The lid of this inner box was not fastened, merely resting closed. He paused one last time, reminding himself that even an empty box might offer a clean container for his own meager possessions. With a final, decisive action, he lifted the lid. It moved smoothly, without the gritty resistance of rust or dust. The candlelight, weak as it was, spilled over the contents, and for a moment Elian thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, fatigued by hunger and dread. The brass box was not empty. It was meticulously, overwhelmingly full. There was no immediate impression of gold or glittering jewels, which he might have expected from the stories he sometimes overheard near the docks. Instead, the box was lined with heavy, dense layers of thick, compressed paper. The immediate contents were dominated by stacks of official-looking documents, tied neatly with fragile, faded red ribbons. These were not currency, but heavy stock paper printed with complex crests and long columns of numbers. They looked like ledgers or deeds. They meant nothing to Elian, save for the intense, dry, papery scent they exuded, the smell of old banking vaults and forgotten transactions. Underneath the papers, however, were two distinct layers of items that instantly commanded his attention and defied the desolate nature of his surroundings. The upper layer, visible now that the papers were pushed aside, consisted of long, narrow, tightly rolled cylinders wrapped in oiled linen. He reached for one, his fingers clumsy with awe and disbelief. He carefully unwound the linen. Inside was a series of thin, rectangular plates, each the size of his palm, made of a heavy, pale yellow metal. They were dull, not gleaming, etched with fine, precise script in a language he did not recognize. They felt intensely dense and cold. He turned one over, and the candlelight caught the edge, proving that this was not merely brass. This was gold, flattened and formed, stamped with complex official seals. They were not coins, but ingots, formed for easy concealment and transport. Elian laid the first ingot carefully on the lip of the brass box. The discovery, however, was too vast, too unbelievable to be immediately comprehended as wealth. It was simply weight, mass, and secret. He pressed deeper into the box. The bottom layer was cushioned by a dark, coarse velvet that crumbled slightly at the edges. Resting upon this velvet were dozens upon dozens of tightly packed dark cloth sacks, each tied at the neck with a thin piece of twine. They were heavy, clinking faintly as he shifted them. He took the nearest sack and gently loosened the knot. He poured a small stream of its contents onto the velvet lining. They were coins, not the flimsy copper pennies or worn nickel shillings occasionally found discarded in the streets, but large, heavy silver coins. They were deeply aged, their surfaces oxidized to a soft, rich patina of grey and black, but the relief was still sharp, the profiles of long-dead monarchs' coats of arms and dates centuries old. The quantity was staggering. The sack he held was easily 5 pounds of pure, ancient silver. Elian sat back, pulling his hands away from the box, as if it might snap shut and trap him. His heart was no longer merely beating, it was hammering against his ribs, a loud, panicked rhythm that drowned out the sound of the rain. This was not a few lost trinkets. This was overwhelming, terrifying abundance. It was the weight of a past life, violently interrupted, hidden deep within the earth. He looked around the crypt. The shadows seemed to loom closer now, not menacingly, but with a silent, heavy witness. His small candle flame cast a frantic, dancing light over the names etched in the stone around him. Peregrine, Montaigne, Blackwood. The box had been hidden by someone who needed absolute, inviolable secrecy, someone who trusted the dead more than the living. Elian, at 11 years old, understood the practical consequences of this discovery instantly, driven by the urgency of perpetual hunger and cold. This was not merely money, it was security. It meant warmth, food, a place with a lockable door, and the absence of the constant aching fear. But this knowledge was instantly paired with the terrible, cold understanding of risk. To possess this was to invite a swift, brutal end if it were discovered. Theft in the city was punishable by severe, merciless violence, and the theft of something this valuable, something that surely belonged to a family, or an organization, or a powerful legacy, was unthinkable. He slowly and meticulously began to catalogue the contents in his mind, though the exact figures were impossible to grasp. There were at least 15 cloth bags of silver coins, several larger, heavier bags of what felt like copper or bronze, and the 10 or so wrapped gold ingots. Beneath all of it were the documents, tightly packed and brittle with age. His physical state, cold, hungry, exhausted, began to clash violently with his overwhelming emotional shock. His body demanded immediate action, to seize this lifeline, to run. But his mind, sharpened by a life lived always on the edge of detection, screamed caution. He reached for the largest gold ingot again. It was profoundly heavy for its size. The metallic, slightly earthy smell of the crypt seemed to enhance the rich, deep scent of the metal. If even one of these could buy him a year of subsistence, then the total haul represented a lifespan of relative comfort. He needed to think, to breathe, to quell the frantic rush of adrenaline that threatened to make him careless. He slowly, with excruciating care, began to close the box. He nestled the heavy bags of coins back into their velvet bed, positioned the ingots, and replaced the tight stacks of documents, smoothing the brittle red ribbons. The metallic clang of the loose lock shackle against the brass was the only sound besides the rain. He lowered the brass lid, which settled with a muffled thud. Then the true task of concealment began. He had to replace the outer wooden panel exactly as he found it. He pushed the heavy panel inward. It resisted, requiring him to shift the brass box slightly to ensure it was seated flush against the back wall. The motion caused a faint, dry, shifting sound from the paper ledgers inside. Elian blew out the candle, plunging the crypt into absolute heavy darkness once more. The faint, diffused light from the vents returned, but the visibility was effectively zero. He retreated to his marble slab, collapsing onto the damp blanket. He did not sleep. Sleep was impossible. He lay rigid, listening to the rain, which now sounded like the heartbeat of his fortune, an insistent rhythmic reminder of the unbelievable weight resting just 3 feet from his head. The crisis of the cold and hunger had been momentarily eclipsed by the crisis of possession. The fear that permeated his life had shifted in nature. Before, it was the fear of death by exposure or starvation. Now it was the terrifying fear of being seen, the fear of revealing this secret, the fear of murder for possession. He spent the long, cold hours until dawn, processing the sheer permanence of the discovery. He couldn't leave it. He couldn't carry it. He couldn't spend it immediately without drawing immediate fatal scrutiny. He needed a plan defined by absolute secrecy and gradual execution. As the first faint grey light of morning began to penetrate the crypt's interior, dimming the reflective puddles on the floor, Elian sat up. His body ached, but the exhaustion was overridden by a nervous energy. The time for dreaming was over. The time for meticulous, agonizing planning had begun. His first priority was food, then absolute security. He knew he could not risk taking any of the gold or the large silver coins to the market. Their age and specific markings would instantly flag them as black market items or stolen relics, drawing the attention of the city guard or, worse, the criminal networks that controlled the flow of antiquities. He needed coinage that was common, widely circulated, and untraceable. He remembered the second set of bags, the heavier, darker metal. He waited until the middle of the morning, when the cemetery was quiet and the handful of groundskeepers were working far in the eastern section. He slipped off the slab and returned to the hidden coffin, his hands moving with practiced, silent care. He opened the outer panel, lifted the brass lid, and reached for one of the larger, heavier sacks. The contents of this sack were different. They were thick, large copper pieces, ancient but worn smooth with no clear markings, common low-denomination currency of an older era, still accepted by some of the most remote or independent vendors in the city's labyrinthine docks district. These were the only pieces he could spend without immediate risk. He calculated swiftly. He could take 5 coins. 5 coins meant 5 small meals, or perhaps 1 large loaf of hard bread and a few days of anonymity. He transferred 5 of the heavy copper pieces to his inner jacket pocket, securing the bag and resealing the vault with painstaking diligence. The walk from the West Wing crypt to the edge of the city, where the docks district began, was a journey of focused dread. Elian usually avoided populated areas, moving like a ghost through alleyways and shadows. Now he walked with 5 heavy coins pressing against his chest, a tangible weight of potential and an unbearable fear of detection. He bypassed the busy central markets, heading instead for a grimy, independent bakery run by a woman known only as Old Anya. She asked no questions, traded purely in goods, and dealt with coinage of every era and origin. The copper felt hot and conspicuous in his hand as he placed it on her counter. Old Anya, a woman with rough hands and eyes that missed nothing, picked up the coin, weighed it in her palm, and nodded silently. "Bread and cheese," Elian whispered, his voice dry. The transaction was swift. He received a heavy, crusty quarter loaf and a sliver of pungent, aged cheese. He did not eat in the market. He turned and walked away, moving rapidly back towards the safety of the cemetery grounds, the smell of fresh bread almost unbearable. He did not stop until he was back inside the crypt, the massive stone door secured by the single flimsy wire he had learned to manipulate to keep others out. Only then, seated on the marble slab, did he allow himself to eat. The bread was hard, but it was real. The cheese was sharp, providing a sudden, much-needed shock of flavor. He chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring the immediate powerful sensation of satiety beginning to counteract the years of emptiness. As he finished, a profound sense of clarity settled upon him, fueled by the momentary relief of hunger. He needed to secure the fortune permanently, transforming it from a terrifying liability into a silent, untouchable reserve. His plan began to form, agonizingly slow and meticulous, built around the unshakable rule: never remove more than he needed, and never, ever move the entire box. The crypt was his vault, and the fortune was the key to his immediate survival, but also to his eventual escape from this perpetual wet shadow. Elian decided that the most immediate and profound requirement was a better method of illumination and a means to secure his location. The single candle was inadequate. He needed oil, a wick, and a small lamp, items that could be purchased openly without suspicion. The next morning, armed with 2 more copper coins, he ventured out again, maintaining the same rapid, furtive movements. He bought a small, sturdy glass oil lamp, heavy and reliable, and a small flask of lamp oil from a hardware vendor who seemed too tired to notice a dirty boy buying mundane items. Returning to the crypt, he filled the lamp. The light it provided was a stable, steady presence, stronger than the flickering candle stub, pushing the darkness back farther and allowing him to see the contours of his immediate refuge with unprecedented clarity. He needed to create a system of defenses. The fortune had to remain untouchable. He began the slow, tedious process of examining the stone walls and floor around the hidden coffin. The area was riddled with rubble and loose stone. He gathered the largest fragments of rock and broken masonry he could move, dragging them across the stone floor with exhausting effort, his thin frame straining against the weight. He began to construct a false wall. The area surrounding the peregrine shelf and the hidden coffin was slightly recessed. He used the large stones to create a low, sturdy barrier, intentionally building it haphazardly, making it look like a natural collapse of the crypt's ancient structure. He filled the gaps with dirt and fine silt from the floor, packing it down firmly. This was not meant to hide the coffin from a determined searcher. It was meant to deter a casual trespasser, making the area look impassable, structurally unsound, and uninteresting. He worked for hours, his muscles trembling with exertion, driven by the frantic internal rhythm of urgency. Days bled into a slow, monotonous routine defined by secrecy, labor, and the calculated risk of leaving the crypt. Each morning he emerged to buy his daily provisions, a piece of bread, perhaps a dried sausage, sometimes a few pieces of fruit that were just on the verge of spoiling. He rotated his purchases between 5 different disparate vendors, never buying the same thing twice in a row, never appearing at the same time. He was creating a life built entirely on anonymity and distribution of risk. Slowly, his physical condition began to improve. The constant intake of moderate food warmed his core, strengthening his muscles. The pervasive, bone-deep cold began to recede, replaced by a manageable chill. But the emotional vulnerability remained intense. He was a creature under observation, though the observer was only himself. He realized he needed a secondary reserve, a way to access his funds without the high-risk routine of opening the elaborate false coffin every day. One rainy afternoon, as the intense drumming of the water outside provided its usual cover, Elian opened the brass box again. The sight of the dense, solid rows of ingots and the tightly packed bags of silver still sent a jolt of shock through him. He focused on the silver coins. They were far less conspicuous than the gold, but still too ancient for daily use. He carefully untied one of the largest silver bags, selecting the most worn, least defined coins. Pieces that looked like they had been handled by generations, their precise details erased by time. He took 10 such coins. He needed to convert them. The idea of approaching a legitimate coin dealer or a banker was madness. He needed a fence, a person who dealt in the shadows and asked no questions about origin, a person who would convert the silver into modern currency at a ruinous rate, but with absolute discretion. He knew of such a person. Silas, a small, hunched man who operated a clandestine exchange deep in the docks district, running his business from a smoky, damp alleyway behind a defunct fish market. Silas was known to deal in old currencies and stolen goods, offering low prices but guaranteed silence. The fear surrounding this trip was immense. This was not the simple, mundane risk of buying bread. This was entering the territory of wolves. Elian hid the 10 silver pieces deep in a small pouch he wore beneath his jacket, bound tightly against his skin. He spent an hour preparing, rubbing dust and grime into his recently cleaned jacket, making himself look as desperate and ignorable as possible. The journey to Silas's alley was a blur of heightened sensory input. The sounds of the port, the creaking of ships, the shouts of sailors, the clanging of metal were overwhelming. He found the alley narrow and smelling strongly of stale seawater and human refuse. Silas sat on an overturned crate, illuminated by the sulphurous glow of a small lantern. He was chewing slowly on something dark and greasy. Elian approached tentatively, stopping 10 feet away. "I need change," Elian murmured, his voice cracking from nervousness. Silas stopped chewing, his small, dark eyes fixing on the boy. "Change? The public bank is 2 streets over, street rat." "Not that kind of change." Elian stepped forward, pulling the small leather pouch from beneath his jacket. Silas's eyes narrowed, focusing on the quality of the leather, not the boy. "Show me." Elian poured the 10 heavily oxidized silver coins into Silas's waiting, cupped hand. The man's gaze shifted immediately to the coins, his fingers running over the ancient reliefs. A brief, terrifying flicker of greed crossed Silas's face, instantly masked by professional indifference. "Antique currency," Silas stated, his voice flat. "Old Republic silver, worth its weight but hard to move without drawing unwanted attention. Who do you work for, boy?" "No one," Elian whispered. "Found them. I need modern shillings, food money." Silas snorted, unconvinced but calculating the risk. The boy was alone, small, and clearly desperate. He weighed the coins mentally. "I'll give you 50 shillings, Silas said, naming a price that was criminally low, perhaps a tenth of the coin's true melt value, but offering the priceless commodity of liquidity and silence. Elian did not hesitate. "Done." Silas produced a thick roll of damp, modern paper money from an inside pocket. He counted out 50 shillings, a colossal amount to Elian, representing weeks of comfortable living. "You bring more, you come back here. No other fences. And you tell no one where you found these or what you bought with the change. Understand?" Silas's threat was quiet, but heavy with implied violence. Elian nodded, his eyes wide. He took the paper bills, folding them instantly and tucking them into the hidden pouch. "Go." Elian retreated instantly, melting back into the shadows of the docks. He did not slow his pace until he was back within the familiar oppressive confines of the cemetery. He was safe. He had secured a liquid reserve. Back in the crypt, the oil lamp burning steadily, Elian took stock of his new resources. 50 shillings could not only buy food, but it could buy tools, clothing, and security. His immediate, most pressing need now was not food, but a means of transportation for his reserve. He needed a place to hide the liquid cash that was separate from the crypt, a dead drop in case he was ever forced to flee his refuge. The cemetery was vast. He found a broken stone effigy near the eastern gate, a weeping angel whose pedestal had cracked severely down the middle. He spent a laborious afternoon scraping out the loose debris from the fissure using his iron shard, creating a cavity just large enough to hold his pouch of modern shillings. He then packed the opening with a mixture of fine mud and dry moss, making the crack look naturally filled and untouched. He was no longer just an orphan hiding from the cold. He was a caretaker of a devastating secret, a planner, a financial strategist, operating entirely on fear and calculation. With his immediate needs met and his reserve secured, Elian turned his attention back to the crypt and the primary source of his fortune. He needed to understand the documents. They might hold the key to the identity of the fortune's owner, and thus the key to the potential danger he faced. He reopened the brass box, carefully lifting out the tight bundles of paper tied with red ribbon. The documents were written in old, spidery cursive, in dense paragraphs of legal and financial terminology. Elian had learned to read by scavenging discarded newspapers and abandoned books, but this language was specialized and archaic. He could only grasp fragmented nouns: trust, shares, title deed, Peregrine estate. The repetition of the name Peregrine struck him. The hidden coffin rested right next to the shelf, bearing that exact name. The dead had guarded their own property. One document, heavily stamped with crests and bearing a faded wax seal, looked different. It was smaller, folded neatly. It was written in a simple, personal hand. Elian unfolded it carefully. It was dated many decades prior, signed simply by Elias P. The letter was brief, stark, and emotional, summarizing a desperate plan. To whomever finds this cash, the upheaval has claimed everything. They suspect the liquidation. My son, Elias Jr., is safe, for now, across the water, but I cannot risk sending him the wealth while the eyes of the committee are watching. I am burying the tangible proof of our assets here, where the dead keep better secrets than the living. The gold ingots are liquidity. The silver is currency for the long term. The documents are the true wealth, title to the Peregrine estate, and 3,000 shares in the Consolidated Rail Trust. This must be redeemed by Elias Jr. when the time is right, or by his heir, if the committee takes me before the danger passes. If you are not of the blood, if you are a simple soul seeking refuge, take the silver. Take what you need for a life of honest work. Do not touch the documents or the gold. To try to convert the gold or the deeds will bring ruin upon you, for they are indelibly marked and watched. The risk is not worth the momentary gain. If you are here, the time is long past. Use the silver for life. Leave the rest to rest. Elian stared at the paper, his heart sinking and soaring simultaneously. The warning was stark, precise, and terrifying. The fortune was not a lost relic. It was a deeply marked, monitored inheritance. To spend the gold or cash the trust shares was to announce his identity and location to unseen, powerful forces, the committee. He had been given permission, explicitly, to take the silver. This emotional validation was overwhelming. He was not a thief. He was a beneficiary, if only to the lowest tier of wealth. He gently folded the letter, replacing it in the box. The weight of the gold and the deeds now felt heavier, imbued not with promise, but with a paralyzing threat. He would not touch them. His focus narrowed exclusively to the 15 heavy bags of ancient silver. He had enough copper coins to last weeks, but the silver was his true savings. He needed a system to slowly and safely convert the silver without alerting Silas or anyone else to the vastness of the supply. He began the methodical, agonizing process of cleaning the silver. He couldn't use harsh chemicals. He spent the next week, in the dim light of the oil lamp, gently rubbing each ancient coin with a small piece of scavenged wool and a mixture of water and fine cemetery dust, removing the thick black oxidation, revealing the dull, matte sheen of the metal underneath. He converted the interior of the crypt into a sterile workspace. The clean coins were rebagged in small, manageable packets of 10, enough to sell to Silas every 3 or 4 weeks for the next year. He stacked these smaller labeled packets next to the main vault, maintaining perfect inventory control. The accumulation of small, consistent acts of self-preservation began to wear down the emotional armor Elian had built. The reality of his stability, the constant presence of food and a dry shelter, allowed his mind to wander away from immediate survival and into the deeper terrain of grief and isolation. He was safe, but utterly alone. The sheer weight of the fortune had magnified his isolation. He could share this secret with no one, not even the casual acquaintance he might make on the street. One evening, nearly a month after the discovery, Elian found himself sitting beside the false wall, the lamp burning low. He looked at the stacks of carefully cleaned silver, the constant, meticulous planning, and felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. He reached out and rested his palm on the cool stone of the wall. He remembered the feeling of the rain, the desperate, hollow ache in his stomach. He was no longer starving, no longer freezing, but the memory of that suffering was sharp, and it was that memory that tethered him to the vast, cold treasure he guarded. He understood now that the fortune wasn't merely silver and gold. It was the purchase of a future life, a second chance. He began to use the converted shillings not just for food, but for self-improvement, small, calculated investments. He bought a simple, thick wool coat and a pair of sturdy leather boots. The feel of dry warmth on his feet and back was a luxury he had forgotten existed. He also bought a stack of books, simple histories, mathematics primers, and geography texts. He read by the light of the oil lamp, tracing the words with his finger, educating himself, transforming the long, solitary nights into periods of preparation. He had to be ready for the world the fortune would buy him. The emotional weight of the letter from Elias P. remained with him. Take the silver. Take what you need for a life of honest work. Elian finally allowed himself to imagine a life outside the crypt. Not a life of immediate luxury, but a life defined by safety and autonomy. He planned the ultimate goal, to amass enough modern currency through the slow sale of the silver to leave the city entirely, moving to a small, distant port where no one knew him, where he could use the currency to apprentice with a trade, carpentry perhaps, or metalwork, a life of quiet, honest contribution. He opened the vault one last time, not for money, but for a moment of affirmation. He looked at the vast, untouchable gold and the ancient deeds. They were fascinating relics, monuments to a powerful lost family and a terrifying organization. He carefully lowered the lid. The weight of the fortune was heavy, but it was no longer crushing. It was a foundation. He had faced the abyss of cold and hunger and survived. Now, armed with secrecy, stability, and the patience necessary for the long haul, he finally deeply understood his responsibility. He wasn't just hoarding, he was investing in his own deliverance. Elian went back to his slab. He laid down, wrapped in his new dry wool coat. The lamp flickered softly. The rain had stopped, replaced by the hushed stillness of a world cleansing itself. He closed his eyes. For the first time since he had found the fake coffin, Elian allowed himself to truly sleep, his body resting against the damp stone, knowing that the most terrifying secret of his life was also the most profound promise of security he had ever known. The orphan who slept in the rainy crypt had found more than a fortune. He had found the foundation for his own self-worth and the emotional resilience to build a life out of stone and shadow.